Hello, I'm Terry O'Sullivan from the Open University Business School. This Pecha Kucha I is about mindfulness and management education. As well as referencing a cult 70s book I never quite managed to finish, the Zen in my title refers to a Buddhist tradition which has influenced mindfulness meditation's focus on mental clarity. Since the late 20th century, mindfulness has become popular in the West, first as a cost-effective source of psychological therapy, and more recently as a well-being technology for all aspects of life, including business and education, supported by a slew of courses, books, videos, and smartphone apps. My own encounter with mindfulness began with a FutureLearn MOOC, Mindfulness for Well-being and Peak Performance, from Monash University. Its authors, Craig Hassard and Richard Chambers, have also written a book on applying mindfulness to teaching and learning. In education, mindfulness is one strand in what has become known as contemplative pedagogy, which, and I quote, shifts the focus of teaching and learning to incorporate first-person approaches which connect students to their lived, embodied experience of their own learning. Barrett, 2014. This reframing of learning as subjective, lived experience is a welcome antidote to the dubious scientific objectivity in which higher education tends to clothe itself, but it creates some genuine tensions when applied to management education. Let's consider some aspects of mindfulness to illustrate what I mean. Mindfulness is difficult to define. You have got to experience it to know it. But in the Coursera MOOC, Foundations of Mindfulness, Dr. Elizabeth Slater of Rice University lists and elaborates 7 attitudinal foundations of mindfulness: suspension of judgment, patience, beginner's mind, trust, non-striving, acceptance, and non-attachment. These qualities resonate with and reinforce one another. Let's begin with suspension of judgment, our tendency to judge all aspects of our experience. Becoming impartial observers through meditation helps us alleviate the hardship of life. But where does this leave the critical evaluation which we prize in management students? We elevate evaluation to the apex of Bloom's taxonomy in its cognitive domain. Criticality is embedded in level-appropriate learning outcomes and framework documents governing the content of qualifications. We also endorse evidence-based judgment as a valuable skill in work-ready graduates. One could argue that Slater's phrase, suspension of judgment, uses the term in the sense of condemnation, as in, don't judge me, and what she's actually arguing for is a suspension of prejudice, an open-mindedness to experience beyond our preset mental schemas. In the spirit of Zen, which sees the unenlightened mind as a muddy swirl of misleading notions, it's hard to argue its suspension of judgment in this sense. Mindful meditation stills us to see things as they are, just as critical thinking allows us to look beyond received wisdom by challenging it. So perhaps mindfulness in suspending judgment and critical thinking in applying judgment are not so incompatible after all. They both aim to connect us with the world more directly. But management education is not just about connection, it's also about making sense of the world and doing something about it. What does mindfulness have to say about sense-making? Slater's list of qualities includes beginner's mind and trust. Keeping a beginner's mind promotes the cultivation of childlike wonder in the face of phenomena. Trust, in this context, is having the confidence to rely on your own subjective experience. In support, Slater quotes John Kabat-Zinn, a seminal figure in Western mindfulness. It is far better to trust in your intuition and your own authority, he writes, even if you make some mistakes, than always to look outside yourself for guidance. If something doesn't feel right, why not honor your feelings? By contrast, management education's approach to sense-making honours third-party triangulation. The curriculum offers a kaleidoscope of research-based theories as lenses through which to examine experience, and valorises evidence and experiment over feelings as a guide to action. With regard to action, there's a further tension between mindfulness and management education. Slater lists patience, non-striving, and acceptance as further attitudinal foundations. They don't tend to be qualities one associates with management, at least in the Western tradition. Igor Ansoff, the godfather of management education as we know it, argued that business schools exist to produce managers who are change agents, impatient with the way things are, striving for improvements, and determined to leave the world different from how they found it. This seems to me to be the major problem with trying to reconcile mindfulness with management education. I can understand that we must be the change we want to see in the world, but the world still needs to change with us. The practice of non-attachment, with which Slater ends her list, is a case in point. Non-attachment, or letting go, and I quote, is a way of letting things be and requires that our hearts be aligned with the way things actually are, unquote. In one sense, management educators might welcome this principle as endorsing, for example, the kind of rigorous and objective situational analysis which precedes sound strategic planning. But it could also be read as an invitation to indifference. Like non-striving, which condemns instrumentality in favour of doing things for their own sake, it seems to encourage us to step over life's challenges rather than wade into them with the intention of doing something about them. 7 minutes is not very long to do justice to the richness of mindfulness as a topic, but I hope that by sharing my concerns about some of its implications for what we take for granted we're doing as management educators, I've given you material for useful meditation. Thanks for your attention.